So why go to Nepal? The mountains, the Himalayan mountains, the tallest features on Earth, the deepest valleys on the planet. But there is more to Nepal than just the mountains, of course. The people are wonderful. Despite desperate situations, they manage to smile more sincerely and consistently than any people that I have witnessed to date. China borders Nepal on the north, and India surrounds the rest of the tiny country. Nepal, therefore, is very influenced by India, but the people take pride in differentiating themselves from Indians. They speak pretty much the same language, look very similar. The majority are Hindu, like in India, and they struggle as a developing nation, similar to their slightly more affluent neighbor. The majority of Nepalese are farmers of some sort, but many are moving to cities to survive, since there is only so much land to form terraces on and plant corn, rice, wheat, vegetables, or raise animals. So how did I come to visit Nepal? It just so happened that my brother and his wife Erin decided to alter their travel plans to accommodate my wishes to experience the country. Originally, they only planned to explore India and Japan, leaving their jobs and Canadian lives behind for over a month to experience life elsewhere. When I heard that they were willing to change everything and go to one of my bucket list locations, I set out to make sure that the opportunity would not be lost. I've traveled by myself before, and I considered doing the same in order to see Nepal, but there is something extremely special about sharing an awe-inspiring experience with people that I love. The memories can be shared for a lifetime. The experience is influenced by people that make different decisions than I do and consider different options compared to my first choices. All in all, the trip is one that becomes immortalized when shared with others, allowing me to relive the wonder that I first experienced while on the journey. I was dropped off by Pat at the Montreal airport on a Thursday evening in mid-March. The air was brisk, a foot of snow lay on the ground. We parted, and I blinked away some tears, stupidly pondering, what if this is the last time I see him? The plane almost left without me. I heard my name on the loudspeaker and hung up my phone to jog across the airport to catch it. 33 hours, 3 planes, 2 buses, many escalators, a half-dozen lines through security checks, and too many blurry-eyed strolls through long corridors later, I stood in a scene of chaos in the Kathmandu airport. Monks, trekkers, tourists, and a few natives filled the expansive single entry point. Climbing and tourist season had just begun, and the country was gearing up to earn a little cash and cater to our high Western standards. I was waiting with about 100 other tourists to get my travel visa, in need of a shower and a good sleep, when I was suddenly jarred from my trance by a hand smashing into my shoulder and almost sending me to the ground. "Hey!" My brother appeared with a mischievous grin on his face next to Erin, Shayna, and Jonathan. My travel mates made it. I could stop worrying that I was going to face the country by myself. The 5 of us were exhausted and slightly dopey, but excited, like little kids, by what we were about to witness. Shayna and Jonathan were very useful in many ways during our travels due to their many years of living in India. They understood how to barter, get the best price for everything, and talk to the locals. Nothing was ever simple, though. We wanted to hire a taxi to our hotel in the center of Kathmandu, and a series of questions, bargaining, scowls, and researching on smartphones ensued. This was the case when attempting to spend money on anything. Apparently you've done the proper amount of bargaining when you walk away with your product or service and your supplier has an angry expression on their face. If you go too low, they will refuse your offer. If you go too high, then they will treat you like you're their best friend, but that's not good for you. I found it very uncomfortable to barter. Always feeling empathy for the poor vendor. They are surviving on so little. I am what is called a sucker. I learned with time to feel less terrible when purchasing items. Upon hopping into our prepaid taxis, we sat dumbfounded on the bench seats, watching as motorcycles, dirt bikes, buses, pedestrians, cows, and feral dogs weaved in and out of the lanes, heading straight towards us and then veering off at the last second. The air was thick with dust, humidity, and diesel fumes. Honking horns sounded in all directions as vehicles warned others that they were approaching. Unlike Canada, where drivers honk to show aggression towards idiotic drivers, Nepalese drivers honk continuously to signal that they are near you and you should be aware of them. A large portion of the population wore masks that covered their nose and mouth in order to filter some of the dust out of each breath and provide them with a little protection from swine flu. I admit, It was a little creepy seeing so many people walking around like they were in a hospital. I eventually gave in to the idea, though, and purchased a mask in order to walk down the busy streets with a little more peace of mind. The air was so dense, I couldn't help but develop a bit of a headache and feel a little sick. I can't believe people live in these conditions. Our little mecca in the middle of the honking dust, piles of garbage, countless open-air shops, food stands, beggars, roosters, and swarming life was a 6-story traditional-style building set back from the busy streets. The Kathmandu Boutique Hotel was accessed by walking down a narrow, piss-soaked alleyway to a tiny courtyard surrounded by wild roses, vines, trellises, chirping birds, various flowers, and tiny tables set up on patio stones. A cup of chai tea was never more than a few minutes away. Our hosts, energetic and eager to impress, checked out our paperwork, served some tea, and answered all of our questions about the area. We entered the building by ducking our heads and climbing many flights of stairs to reach our rooms on the top level. Mind your head warnings sat above every shallow doorway. I suppose Westerners are much taller than the average Nepali. The sun was setting and twilight was beautiful. I took in the view of all the activity happening in apartments and courtyards below. "You guys ready to eat?" I asked Shayna and Jonathan while knocking on their little door. We gathered in the courtyard, filled with tea, and made our way into the bustling streets, armed with our memory and slight sense of direction. The city is not laid out like a grid with street signs. You just have to remember which way you walked, what shops or features you passed, and then try to retrace your steps later, hopefully remembering the right direction at busy roundabouts where crossing the intersection of more than 4 streets involves taking your life into your hands. It was even more challenging at night as there were no streetlights, only the glare of headlights and lit-up windows. A pile of garbage formed one of our way markers. This would be a very bad place to be intoxicated. You'd never find your way back to the hotel. The sun set and our feet carried us to numerous outdoor gear shops. My travel mates were looking for cheap sleeping bags, hats, and water purification tablets. Eventually, after lots of haggling, we got what was needed and found a second-story restaurant where we sat on the cushioned ground to eat momos, which are Tibetan-style dumplings, and dalbat, which is spicy lentil soup, rice, and vegetable curry. Tea was served. The food took forever to arrive. Jonathan studied the music being played in the background, and Aaron passed out on the soft floor. To think that we had finally made it to this place and were sitting in the epicenter of a country with the most dramatic topography in the world was a little sublime. We slept deeply, but restlessly, adjusting to a time zone almost 10 hours ahead of our norm. Roosters and the bark of wild dogs woke us with the rising sun the next morning. We met our driver, Raj Kumar, in the street with our large backpacks. He tied them to the roof of his Jeep and drove for many hours out of the capital, away from the slums and grime, climbing in elevation along one of the few existing narrow, winding highways that cross the country. Raj didn't say much and remained intensely focused on Mario Karting us through oncoming traffic. We tried to nap and read, but most of the drive was spent staring out the window trying not to get nauseous from the pothole-ridden road and quick maneuvers. Indian dance music and intermittent conversation set the pace for the drive as terrace agriculture slowly unveiled itself to us. Thousands of long terraces, sown with corn, barley, rice, cabbage, and other vegetables, lined the mountainsides. It was spring and life was fresh and vibrant. Foliage and crops were lush and only weeks old to the landscape. Stopping so Jonathan could buy a branch loaded with 40 mini bananas, and then later enjoying more tea and warm Coca-Cola, we broke up the long ride with pit stops to try out rural, hole-in-the-floor toilets, consume different snacks, and stretch our legs. Coca-Cola advertisements were painted on buildings everywhere. We succumbed to the pressure of the ads. It was overwhelming how much of the landscape was littered with cola logos. Tata trucks, painted in psychedelic colors, made up the majority of the vehicles on the road. Cows regularly wandered and stood in the middle of the busy thoroughways. Goats played and nibbled on grass next to the highway. The air became more crisp, clean, and slightly cooler as we approached Pokhara. Gear rented. Check. Transportation to and from Astam Eco Village, check. Take out Nepalese rupees to survive in the mountains, check. Buy wine for the top of the mountains, check. Arrange a guide for our Ghorepani Poon Hill trek, check. Buy lots of cookies, done. A final ride up a steep mountain slope along a switchback goat trail smashed my head on the Jeep window and induced nausea. But we finally reached a point where no more vehicles were seen. I couldn't ask for a more welcoming atmosphere. The family that ran the tiny operation were local farmers whose kin had worked the land for about 200 years. They were now housing guests in basic cabins with painted concrete walls, slate roofs, rain barrels supplying the only water, blankets supplying the only heat, and solar panels supplying the only electricity. Namaste! Pressed hands, smiles, enthusiasm, and tea met us at the top of the mountain. Our hosts couldn't grin enough. They asked us about our trip and plans for the coming days, then led us to our rooms. Soon, we were walking through the well-kept gardens. Peering over the landscape, I could see a village far below, along with nearby towering mountains barely visible through the lingering rain clouds. A Canadian family was also staying at the village, and so they joined us in a sloppy game of hacky-sack to shake away the lethargy induced by a long drive. We ate together, talked about where we were from, and where we were going. The group had a lot of travel experience and appeared very content to be journeying for long periods. The middle-aged couple had actually adopted a Nepalese child many years ago, and they were on this trip to show their kid her roots. The sun set, my mind fell into a state of bliss as rain softly pattered the slate roof. My sleeping bag kept me warm. I read and soon slept soundly in my tiny bed under a bug net in a room shared with Shayna and Jonathan, their single beds pressed together for intimacy. Again, we rose with the sun, refreshed, able to breathe cool mountain air, stepping outside to a panoramic view of mountains and stunning vegetation. Thick, traditional Nepalese porridge filled our stomachs, along with honey lemon ginger tea, before we packed up to follow a narrow path that led down to the distant village that I stared at the night before. Our host stood on the side of a steep ledge while pointing to a small Hindu temple on a mountainside in the distance. He told us to follow a footpath along the mountain, through a village and backyards and farm terraces, then turn downhill when we reached the temple, and follow that path until we came to a bus stop on the side of a road where a jeep would be waiting to transport us to the official start of our trek. We followed an ancient woman carrying a heavy load suspended from her head, wearing flip-flops and a vibrant gown, until she took a turn in another direction. She moved swiftly and paid no mind to us. Dogs followed our group. School children in their neatly pressed uniforms asked for chocolate, and knees began to ache for a few in our group. Ram, a 23-year-old local and graduate of mathematics, met us at our pickup location. He would be our very excellent guide for the duration of our trek. A short trip along a narrow road took us to the very busy village of Nepal on the edge of the Annapurna mountain range. The place was loaded with people like me, as well as locals who were trying to cash in on the disposable income of foreigners. Every shop pretty much looked the same, with a small selection of pop, Mickeys of liquor, chips, and chocolate bars. Tiny restaurants lined the rushing river, and prayer flags draped the entrance to the conservation area. People came from all parts of the planet to do this trek. So many languages and accents were heard. Most groups were led by a local guide, but some adventurous travelers traveled solo and joined groups as they pleased or simply moved alone. And so, the real walking began. When I say real, I mean flat ground ceased to exist. At first, we followed a narrow gravel road that some jeeps could still traverse, but as elevation was gained and slower hikers were weeded out, the road eventually came to an end, and only ponies, mules, and humans continued upwards. Soon, the narrow gravel path turned into a flight of stairs that never ended. I think someone has counted how many stone steps led up the mountainside before. I tried counting for a few minutes, but quickly lost my focus, along with my breath. We were all adjusting to this new way of living, no longer passively watching the scenery go by in a jeep or plane. Now, we were in charge of interacting with every person we passed, every step forward, and carrying every useless possession on our backs. Breathe in. Step up. Breathe out. Step up. Breathe in. Ask Graham about every plant I saw. Breathe out. Check to make sure my group is still close by. Step up. Breathe in. Realize I should slow down. Step up. Breathe out. Step up to a stone bench where I can lean my backpack against it, take the weight off, and rub sunscreen all over my face. It was hot. My pasty skin was thinking about burning. A wide-brimmed hat and long sleeves kept me from roasting. I guzzled back water as my group joined me in one of our many water breaks. We watched as everyone we had passed walked on by, gasping, leaning on walking sticks, and slowly pulled their weight up the land of infinite steps. The trek was a blur of carefully laid steps, heavy breathing, vegetarian cuisine, sweat, cool wind, trains of panting fellow trekkers, vibrant prayer flags strung from every awesome vantage point, tea houses serving the most delicious dalbat, roasties, garlic soup and masala, chai or honey lemon ginger tea, increasingly stunning views of the highest mountains in the world, lines of pack-laden mules being led up the mountain to supply tea houses with food and concrete for repairing paths, thoughtful conversations with Jonathan about music or Indian culture, elders with loads hanging from their heads, namaste, 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 and a constant view of the back of Ram's head as he pressed on. His attitude was intensely positive, always smiling and telling us the names of mountains about and of the customs of Nepal. I had my own room at each tea house we stayed in overnight. It was kind of nice to have a little privacy. I had been sleeping in airports, planes, jeeps, and shared rooms with the couples in our group. I called myself the official fifth wheel. Shayna and Jonathan and Emmanuel and Aaron had been very gracious with me. I realized that odd numbers makes it more difficult to book transportation and accommodations. From Nepal, where our trek officially began at 1,010 meters above sea level, to Uluru at 2,750 meters, to Ghorepani at 2,840 meters, to Poon Hill at 3,210 meters, to Gandruk at 1,940 meters, and then back down to Nepal, where we began our trek, at 1,010 meters above sea level. We climbed over 2 kilometers in elevation and hiked over 70 kilometers of steep terrain. Of course, the elevation gain does not account for all of the up and down along the way. Ram would check in with each member, asking, "TK? Like, are you alright?" We would reply, "Tikcha," if we were feeling strong with our thumbs up, or "Tik China," if we were struggling, a thumbs down. To keep us moving, he'd say, "Jam jam," as in, "let's go." We worked well as a group. Everyone had periods of time where they weren't at their best. Aaron felt completely exhausted on our first day and took each step slowly, just making sure that she kept moving. No one minded. We all understood that we would each have our own struggles and we'd make it through as a group. Her slowness forced me to move in a way that allowed more time to take in the scenery, get to know Ram, and enjoy my surroundings. Shayna struggled with knee issues, springing up from a long-forgotten injury. She borrowed a walking pole and hobbled along without complaint despite her great pain. At one point, I looked back to see her moving like a chimpanzee, using her hands and feet to carry herself up slope. What resilience! Jonathan pulled a muscle while joining in a game of mountaintop hacky sack, but barely mentioned the pain. Emmanuel pissed Aaron off when he packed her clean underwear away before she could change into them. He had to deal with dagger eyes for a short period. I struggled only slightly with being the official fifth wheel and having to warm myself up on chilly nights with no heat but that of my own. Thankfully, Shayna was a certified yoga instructor and we became some of her first students. Upon arriving at our tea house destinations on the side of a cliff each evening, she would clear a space on the patio, steal a bunch of chair cushions, and then we'd all form a show for the cooks, trekkers, and locals as we followed Shayna's lead in a very rewarding series of stretches. Ram and small children joined in out of curiosity. Shayna would reposition their limbs if they didn't understand her directions. Eventually, a small child took it upon herself to reposition my limbs when she noticed my poor posture. I laughed and let her take charge. Jonathan shouted, "I found my chilies!" when he leaned over in a pose and his toque fell off of his head, revealing his lost prize. We burst out laughing. He insisted on getting chili peppers everywhere he went, but he forgot that he stored them in his hat, and that's when he found them while he was doing yoga. A day didn't go by where the sun rose without us witnessing it. One morning I awoke after tossing and turning at 4 a.m. to hike to the summit of Poon Hill with my brother and our guide. It was pitch black, cold, and I wanted to go back to sleep. I strapped my torch to my head, geared up, and followed Ram and my brother up a path to greet the spectacular mountain vista as the sun rose, a cup of warm masala tea in my mitten and breath hanging in the air. We passed by a lady getting altitude sickness, retching into some bushes on the side of the path. A line of tiny lights slowly climbed up the slope with us. Hundreds of sun and mountain worshippers all lined the peak with cameras and tea ready to greet the wonderful day. There was Annapurna 1 at 8,091 meters, Dalaguri at 8,167 meters, Machapuchare at 7,000 meters, and Annapurna South, among other amazing snow-capped peaks. Suru! I toasted my brother as we watched the sky light up and the landscape unfold. We celebrated St. Patrick's Day the night before, Emmanuel and I drinking Nepalese wine as we sat around a wood-burning stove in the frosty and rustic lounge with a dozen or so trekkers, Nepalese cooks and guides. Jonathan was coaxed into playing his bansuri to our group. Guys passed around tiny flasks and filled their small cups. An ancient woman sat hunched with a huge smile on her face and tapped her knees as she listened to Jonathan play. An iPhone and portable speaker formed the sonic canvas with the drone of the Indian Tanpura. He played classical ragas. He's been studying the music in India for about 8 years. Normally he plays the sax to fuse East and West music into an experimental jazzy traditional sound. After a few very chill tunes, Ram got everyone clapping and even danced with me and a few others while he and a few other Nepalese guys sang a traditional Himalayan trekking song called Rasham Firiri. They got people to chant the chorus, hands clapping, feet tapping, and fingers waving. It was pretty neat. I didn't know how to dance and fumbled my way through, laughing, but we all got into it, singing and keeping the rhythm. Daniel, a German fellow that became our travel buddy, stared at Jonathan as he played and asked him very bluntly after a very relaxed song, "So, what is the purpose of the music you play?" This, after everyone was immersed in the hypnotic state induced by his music. It was ridiculous. The question really surprised everyone, but that is the nature of Germans. They are apparently very straightforward with their curiosity and may be considered rude in many settings. That's what my brother tells me. Daniel, the straight-to-the-point German guy, joined us for the remaining part of our trek, enjoying listening to our stories and telling of his own journeys. We tried to outrun a thunderstorm as it rolled in like a loud and angry giant, echoing through the majestic mountains, making the ground more treacherous to skip across, glossing the world's greatest rhododendron forest, and intensifying the brilliant red flowers of the gnarled old trees against a magnificently dark background. And it also stirred up curious langur monkeys. The monkeys, which I'd never seen before, squealed from rock ledges and high above in the rhodo branches. They hopped from tree to tree, calling out and staring at me when I stopped to stare back. It was a strange feeling to be trailed by creatures that were curious and capable of doing whatever they wanted. Gandruk, the last tiny village that we stayed in on the trek, was the most surreal place we chose to overnight in. The village is a major recruitment center for the famous Gurkha soldiers. It didn't look like modern civilization had reached it, though, except for Western snacks and a few shops. Otherwise, the narrow stone pathways, stone and mortar farmhouses, steps leading off in all directions through tunnels to various gardens and courtyards, like an Escher painting, candlelit communal bedrooms, wood-burning stoves, mules, chickens, goats, and subsistence farming transported me to another time. A local woman that didn't speak a word of English welcomed us into her home. We ducked our heads through the shallow entrance and took in the sight of one long, dimly lit room that housed everything her family needed. 3 beds, a stove, shelves, tiny windows, a few rugs on the floor, heavy utensils and bowls, a tap outside for rinsing, and a few possessions on minimalist furniture. The doors were always open, animals free to wander in and out at random. Any certificates or accomplishments were displayed proudly on the outside wall near the doorway. Gandrik provided us with the most serene environment, interesting culture, and spectacular views. When we woke to watch the sunrise, the sky was a sharp, blemish-free canvas of perfection, allowing each ray from the rising sun to illuminate the snow-capped peaks with lines of zealous golden hues, slowly spreading down into the lush valleys below. Ram and Daniel eventually left us at 2 different roadsides before we hiked a final section up to our eco-village tea house. We hugged, thanked Ram, saying, "Dhanyabad," and promised to get in touch. Back in Kathmandu, we found ourselves wandering the madness of the streets, feeling a little overwhelmed by the amount of human impact, the gangs of people, piles of waste, terrible air pollution, vehicle density, and incessant honking. The historical site of Durbar Square was a free-for-all when the sun went down and locals took over. Tourists were out of the picture, except for a few like us. People gathered around and along all levels of the structures, eating, laughing, going on dates, drinking, and shouting like a great party was taking place all around us. We climbed to the top of one of the structures to be part of the enthusiastic Saturday night crowd. During our final day in the country, we taxied to 2 different monkey temples in the capital. The first one, a Buddhist temple, is one of the definitive experiences of Kathmandu. Mobbed by monkeys and soaring above the city on a lofty hilltop, the monkey temple is a fascinating, chaotic jumble of Buddhist and Hindu iconography. The compound is centered on a gleaming white stupa, topped by a gilded spire painted with the eyes of the Buddha. Coming to the temple is an intoxicating experience, with ancient carvings jammed into every spare inch of space and the smell of incense and butter lamps hanging heavy in the air. The mystical atmosphere is heightened in the morning and evening by local devotees who make a ritual circumnavigation of the stupa, spinning the prayer wheels set into its base. It is a great place to watch the sunset over Kathmandu, though we didn't have the time to do it. According to legend, the Kathmandu Valley was once a lake, geological evidence supporting this, and the hill now topped by the temple rose spontaneously from the waters. After visiting the first temple, we headed to a place where I gained the smell of death on my clothes. Lucky me, I would be traveling for many days in those death-soaked clothes, sitting next to strangers on planes and trains. Pashupati is one of the most important Hindu temples in Nepal and is located near the Bagmati River. At the ghats, or stairs where you can descend to the river, plateaus are made that are used for the open-air cremations that take place on a daily basis. As soon as we approached the Bagmati River, we saw the smoke of a cremation that was taking place, as well as dead bodies next to the water. In Nepal, death ceremonies vary, depending on the class of a person. There are several cremation places, one for the royal family, one for rich families with prestige, and several others for the, quote, normal people. The cremation places for the, quote, normal people were located on the other side of the bridge, out of sight from the places that are used by the royals and the rich. Most people watched the rich people being cremated. The smell was pretty putrid as I got within feet of one of the dead bodies. We walked around the entire site except for the main temple that only allowed Hindus inside. Avoid tossing money to ash-covered stone or drunk monks sitting against rock walls. Avoided buying jewelry that was sold in every nook of the sacred site, and followed wild monkeys as they found food to eat, opening up trash bags. Eventually, I left my group and headed to a separate gate at the airport, feeling like I was leaving behind something very important, a piece of me. I made my way to a lonely existence of anonymity, being mistaken for a man 3 times in the Mumbai airport by guards. It was terrible. I cried. sleeping on airport benches, being bitten by 200 mosquitoes, walking all over downtown London, sleeping in a hole-in-the-wall hotel room, and getting caught up in football hooliganism in a downtown pub with an entire pub singing and chanting as police made their way inside. I had a memorable trip. Many memories can't be expressed in a way that does justice to the moments. I'm so happy that I was able to witness the Himalayas. I gained an understanding of what pollution and tragic poverty really is. I learned that those with very little can still be very happy and at peace. Traveling with others is much more rewarding than traveling by myself, but it does require more patience. I move more slowly. I miss the tranquility of solitude, but I learned so much more, and I laughed a lot more. I will remember the feeling of being watched by strange creatures in the trees, the brilliant sunrise over the mountains, the frustration of mistaken gender in the airport, the fear of traveling alone, and the great freedom and confidence gained by the end of my journey. Language barriers, pollution, a totally different diet, completely different cultures, intense terrain, and obscure animals can be overcome and appreciated.